Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 36. Knowledge resistance. It's a fancy term for a frustrating reality, the human tendency to shut out facts and cling to beliefs, even when they're demonstrably wrong.
Pigeons are just government surveillance drones. Have you seen that?
The birds are not real? No, birds aren't real. Yeah, go on. If birds were real, could I do this? I'm a government drone.
Knowledge resistance isn't just stubbornness, though. Researchers see it as a complex interplay between emotions, how we think, our social circles, and the constant flow of information we're bombarded with. It's a cognitive breakdown, a failure of our systems to properly weigh evidence, be it from our senses, other people, or even the media. Here's the kicker. This knowledge resistance isn't a conscious choice, but rather a glitch in our mental machinery. We're not all equally susceptible, and the glitch can manifest in different ways depending on the situation. Now, innumeracy, our collective struggle with numbers, fits squarely into this fascinating puzzle. Innumeracy can be both a symptom and a cause of knowledge resistance. Let's explore how. We've all heard the lament, I'm just not good at math. Unlike illiteracy, which has quite a stigma in society, innumeracy is a cultural badge of honor almost, worn by countless individuals with a shrug and a smile. But here's the wrinkle. This widespread innumeracy, this collective math phobia, might be making us more susceptible to, well, bad ideas. Studies show a whopping 29% of adults in the U.S. score at level 1 or below on numeracy scales. Think simple tasks like counting objects, basic ordering, or understanding simple percentages like 50%. That's the world these individuals navigate. Lower numeracy skills are linked to poorer reasoning, which means navigating an information landscape rife with misinformation can be a real minefield. So the answer seems obvious, right? Let's pump up everyone's numeracy. And sure, on the whole, that'd be fantastic. I'm all for it. But even that's not going to do it, because here's the plot twist. It turns out even the numerate among us aren't immune. Enter the fascinating phenomenon of motivated numeracy. Faced with highly charged issues, ones that touch our identities or political affiliations, even those with strong quantitative skills can throw logic out the window, cherry-picking data and twisting statistics to fit their pre-existing beliefs. I'm saying all this to say the problem is not so simple. And that's where our guest today comes in.
I'm Åsa Wikforss. I'm from Sweden, but I have my PhD from the US. I'm a professor of philosophy at the Stockholm University, and I have come very interested. I work in questions having to do with knowledge and epistemology, and I've gotten quite involved with issues having to do with what we call knowledge resistance. And I lead a large research project that's cross-disciplinary with political scientists and psychologists and media and communication scholars called Knowledge Resistance, Causes, Consequences, and Cures.
Dr. Wikforss is here to shed light on the complexities of knowledge resistance, unpacking the reasons behind it and exploring potential solutions. So don't miss a beat, buckle up, and get ready to dive into the fascinating world of why we sometimes reject evidence even when it's staring us right in the face. Åsa Wikforss, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
I really like this term, knowledge resistance. But, so I'm kind of curious. I understand it's sort of interdisciplinary. What is the relationship between knowledge resistance and these psychological phenomena like confirmation bias and motivated reasoning?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. What knowledge resistance as a general phenomenon is the tendency to resist available knowledge, right? So you can study that from different disciplines. And what the psychologists do, they tell us what are the mechanisms that drive this type of evidence resistance, because that really is what it is. It's resisting available evidence. There's knowledge you could have if you just took in the evidence, but you resist it. And then it's a perfectly empirical question that's up to the psychologists to investigate what are the psychological mechanisms that drive this phenomenon. And the things you mentioned are all candidate mechanisms, right? It may not be one, it may be several. So confirmation bias is one of them, certainly, which is the tendency to do what we can to confirm what we already believe. But there's also a very prominent mechanism is this thing called motivated reasoning. And it's really interesting because often people say, well, it shows people are stupid and irrational, but it's not really like that, because motivated reasoning involves employing your reasoning skills as best as you can to defend a belief that has become valuable to you. It is irrational because you defend the belief against, evidence that comes against it, but you use your reasoning capacities to give reasons why you don't have to change your belief. So it's not as if we sort of point blank resist knowledge. We employ our reasoning capacities to defend our beliefs that we have come to care about. And it could be any kind of beliefs, right? It doesn't have to do with politics. It could be beliefs about, our children, how excellent they are and wonderful in every respect. And we don't want to take in evidence against those beliefs, right? Or beliefs about how, our own skills and or capacities and so on. That we have the greatest audience ever, as a famous president insisted in believing, or at least saying. So these kinds of beliefs can become valuable for whatever reason, and then these mechanisms can kick in, and it can be different mechanisms, and that's the kind of thing that psychology investigates.
Yeah, and it's almost like smart people are actually better at it, right? Because you can come up with those narratives that convince yourself.
Well, there was some evidence for that, but it was never that clear, and it's been kind of debunked. What is true is that the very smartest people, they tend to not do this as much. So, but it is also true that being fairly good at reasoning does not protect you. Right. It can happen to you anyhow.
Yeah, I think it can happen to most of us. It's probably a fair statement.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very important thing, because people, when you study this sort of thing, there's also the talk of fact resistance. I prefer the term knowledge resistance. And they say, oh, you're saying that some people are fact resistant. And I'm saying, no, we're not saying that some people have this as a trait. This is a phenomenon that can happen to anyone. It's a psychological mechanism, or few mechanisms that we have within us that can kick in if the circumstances are of a certain sort. It can happen to anyone. So it's not as if there's certain types of people that are affected by this only.
Yeah, and I think another piece, I think that's somewhat connected here is this idea of, I think, social epistemology. The idea that, like, we often think that we come to know things because of reason only, and we're inside our heads and all that. But, we're actually learning, we actually, a lot of the things we know from interacting with people in these social scenarios. And I think that sort of plays into this in some way as well, right?
Oh, yeah, it's absolutely central. In my first book, which was called Alternative Facts on Knowledge and Its Enemies, I spent a lot of time spelling out the social dimension of knowledge, because it is a distinctive trait of human knowledge, right? There are two important sources of knowledge for us. There is, experience, observation, how things feel and look, and sound and smell and all that. And that's a very important source through our senses for knowledge. But that's also a kind of knowledge that animals get, of course. That's how you orient yourself in your daily life, and that's how animals orient themselves. But in addition, we as human beings have this other way of getting knowledge. We can get knowledge from other people who know more, which is because we have this sort of division of epistemic labor, as it were, or cognitive labor, where all of us in our lives, or professional lives, or ordinary daily lives, collect knowledge of various sorts. And then we can use language, because we have this amazing tool of language. We can use that to communicate this knowledge to other people. Across generations, we have knowledge accumulation in a way that other animals don't have. That's a unique human trait. So this is our great strength. We can accumulate knowledge, and we can do these amazing things and know things about the origins of the universe and things like that. But it's also a vulnerability, because it means that kind of knowledge, and this goes for, most knowledge about society, about history, about geography, about science, about what have you, comes from other sources, of various sources. It's not because you've been there and seen it and experienced it. And that creates vulnerabilities, because you can't, if a trustworthy source comes to you with knowledge, if you don't trust this source, if you don't believe what they say, you're not going to get the knowledge. It means that knowledge requires trust. So if you lose trust in reliable sources, you will also lose knowledge. And of course, if you start trusting unreliable sources, you will end up believing what's false. So we're incredibly sensitive. The trust component makes us very, very, very vulnerable, both to efforts to manipulate this trust, to make us trust what's not trustworthy, or undermine trust in research science. This is one thing that's been going on a lot the last few years. And it sort of poses this problem that most of the things we know, like you were saying before, we kind of know rather superficially. We sort of know about climate change, right? But most of us, we can say a few words about, the greenhouse effect and these things. But if a climate denier comes and has all this data and graphs and things and numbers, we are not really typically equipped to respond to that, because we mostly just trust the scientists, which is a rational thing to do. But it makes you vulnerable in that sense too, to someone who comes and counter-argues you. You just don't know enough to respond. So this is this is absolutely a very central part of what's going on right now.
Yeah, and that sort of, you see a lot of people talking sort of about that we are not so much in a post-truth world as a post-trust world, which is sort of the post-trust, I guess, sort of drives the post-truth. But
yeah,
and that's an interesting perspective there, because most of us do trust an expert. That's like how we get through the day. We don't have enough hours in the day to go become an expert ourselves on every single topic. And it's sort of explains why the whole do your own research sort of argument can kind of work in these scenarios, because, most of us we're not any good at research, really, right? Most of us we don't have hours in the day, and I'm not an expert in all those fields. I love a lot of this science, but I'm trusting the scientists for a lot of it. I don't know all the economic factors when I go down an economic paper. I don't understand all that. I'm trusting an expert source, this pool of experts, and I'm trusting the system, the epistemic system that has peer review and things like that, right? And checks and balances and guardrails, and when I do my own research, there's no guardrails.
No, you're making some extremely good points there. First of all, that doing research in an area requires expertise. It just does. That's the level of accumulation of knowledge we have now. You can't just go into an area you don't know yourself and figure it out. It just doesn't work that way. It's too difficult. So the other really important point you mentioned here is precisely that we need to look to the institutions, to the system. Because why should we trust science? It's a good question, right? And one should have a good answer to it. But we tend to think that we should trust science because the individual scientists are so, brilliant or knowledgeable or whatever. But that's not a good answer. Of course, they need their skills and they need their training and all that. But the reason we should trust science is that the scientists belong to an institution which has all these checks and balances that you were talking about, peer review, for example. We have all this conference, we have all these ways of disputing and disagreeing, sort of institutionalized disagreements that are at the very core of science. And I think we need to talk more about that when we talk about trusting science. I think scientists think that if you only talk about scientific method, people will understand that sort of works. But if they don't trust scientists, if they have this mistrust and so on, you need to talk about the institutions that keep the scientists honest, as it were. Because that is really an essential reason why science works. I think it connects with the social dimension of knowledge again. So I think that is something we have to communicate around a whole lot more than we do. And it's worth stressing, of course, also that individual scientists, as individuals, we fail miserably all the time because we have our biases, and scientists have confirmation bias as well, for example. We want our theories to be true. But what keeps us honest is that we have to defend these theories against objections from other scientists all the time.
And I think, yeah, that's a good way to describe it. And I think there's another piece of it a little bit that, as humans, we like sort of these black and white, very clear, categorization sort of things. And, to some degree, science is never exactly that, because it's always sort of the best incorrect version of the world that we know today, right? It's never it's never going to be 100% right. It's always just getting better. It's better, now than it was 50 years ago, this kind of thing. And that can be a little uncomfortable.
That is uncomfortable. I mean, there are two things. It's never 100% right. No theory is. The other is that we never have proofs. What we have is evidence, and it can be stronger or weaker. If it's strong enough, it over a certain threshold, it qualifies as knowledge. And most philosophers these days would say that threshold is not so strong that it amounts to proof. That is to say, it doesn't have to be the case that your evidence excludes error, because that doesn't happen outside of mathematics and logic. If you have a logical proof, there you go, given that your premises are true and all that. But it doesn't work that way in science. So we have evidence that makes the conclusion highly probable and so on. So it's always a question of where you are on that sort of ladder. And we don't know. We often don't know. And the best we can do, or the rational thing to do, is believing in accordance with our best overall evidence. But we always have to be, and this is a sort of fallibilist kind of insight, we always have to be prepared that we may be wrong. So that's a very important thing to sort of stress when one talks about science, because otherwise people think, oh, the scientists said that, but now they changed their mind and they're all kind of all over the place and not to be trusted. It doesn't work that way. We accumulate evidence, we do our best. When it's strong enough, we believe it, we believe our conclusions, and often enough it's then true and we have knowledge. But we may be wrong, and therefore we have to be open to objections and to changing our minds. That's in the very nature. At the same time, of course, and this is also sort of one of those moves that the science deniers make, the very fact that we may be wrong, which is almost always true, is not in itself an objection. It's not enough to say, well, the climate scientists may be wrong. Yeah, well, probably because, but if there's absolutely no reason to think they're wrong, then your skepticism would be misplaced. So I think it's important to be able to have those two thoughts in mind at the same time. We may be wrong and therefore open to objections, but if no serious objections come forth, it's irrational not to believe the science.
Right, and I think part of that is why it can make people a little uncomfortable. So it feels like, it seems like this knowledge resistance is sort of just pervasive. It's worse than it's ever been, but that might be a misperception itself, right? That just might be the way we're learning about things. But so I guess there's a couple questions there. One is, how do you measure it, and does your research sort of say that it's worse than ever, or has things sort of always been this way?
Well, I mean, we haven't done it's. Yeah, how do you measure it? It's a question of measuring what people believe, then, right? Right. And of course, so there are polls what people believe about GMOs and about climate change and vaccines and so on. And then people say what they believe. And then, first of all, you need to know that what they say is actually what they believe. That's one problem we have, especially when it comes to political beliefs. Where there's a lot of cheerleading going on, cheerleading beliefs. So they say that, yeah, Trump won the election, but they don't actually really believe that. But they say it when the pollsters come. So that's one problem. Just what do people even believe, right? And then there's a question across time. Do we know that people now are more resistant to knowledge than before? And what people and So I think there are no good quantitative studies like that. But what you can say are things you can see in polls that increasing number of people have become skeptical of certain scientific claims. Those kinds of things you can see in certain populations, and those topics where the resistance kicks in tend to be topics that are of relevance to policy, right? And that's not a surprise, because when policy comes into the picture, it's politics, it's decision-making time, right? So when the science, together with some widely shared values, seems to suggest that a certain policy is the right one, like let's do something about climate change before we have these wildfires and we can't breathe anymore and so on. When it points that way and the values are widely shared, then it tends to instead go back and question the knowledge. Right? No, it's not really that bad. It's not really caused by us. It's not really, so it is the connection with policy that makes these factual claims, because they are factual claims, not value claims about climate change and vaccines and GMOs and so on. That these factual claims become politicized, as it were, and then there will be emotions around that, and then knowledge resistance will kick in. So you get it for certain types of claims, not for all types of claims.
Yeah, and in terms of polling too, there's also a lot of polling showing that there's been a significant decline in trust of scientific institutions.
When it comes to trust, we know for sure, and that's true in the US, that's true in Sweden, that's true in a lot of countries where I've seen data. Two observations there. One is that it's not typically, at least not in Sweden, and I think that's true in the US too, not typically the case that trust in science is down in general. What has happened is that trust has become politically polarized. So how much you trust science or universities or media depends on which party you vote for. And that, of course, is an extraordinarily unfortunate situation, because that leads to this divided worldview, precisely because if you don't trust science, you're not going to believe what the scientists say and so on. So that's a new phenomenon, and that I think is driven by politics. There's been some concerted efforts by politicians to undermine trust, and then you get these effects.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, exactly. And when you think, often when people think about something, these knowledge resistance type effects, we tend to immediately jump to things like flat Earth and a number of other big, conspiracy type things. But I see these effects in much more everyday, issues. The tribe left, tribe right kicks in for things like immigration and healthcare, climate change, economic policies, even. Mm-hmm. And in all these cases, we tell ourselves these narratives to sort of support what we believe. And everybody, circling back to sort of this idea of everybody sees the flat earther, and everybody kind of wants the magic pill to fix someone else, to change someone else's mind. But how do we become more aware of our own blind spots on these other, sort of everyday issues?
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I think focus on flat earthers and so on is kind of entertaining, but ultimately not that interesting or useful, because it is an extremist little group and they're having their sort of club. It's not a widely spread belief that the earth is flat. But there are all sorts of other beliefs of the sort that you mentioned that are, again, policy relevant, that where we can all have these reactions. How does one deal with it sort of in one's own case? That's what you're asking. And some people talk about, well, we should all be aware that we have these biases. We should have knowledge of our confirmation bias and so on. And then, the problem is that knowing that you have these biases doesn't help. That is quite clear from a lot of research. So unfortunately, it's not that simple. I think from an individual point of view, one needs to try to use one's reason as well as one can, and really always ask oneself the relevant questions. What are the best objections to my belief? Have I looked around? Have I tried to find these objections? Have I assessed these objections in a good way? Really just to employ your reasoning capacities as well as you can, and not and try to sort of disconnect the facts from the values when it comes to policy questions, right? And from the emotions, and really just say, look, this is just a question of how the world is. How the world is doesn't dictate any policy. It depends on what we value and so on. And let's keep these things distinct, and let's just try to find out how the world is by looking at the best data and the best evidence and the best arguments. So one can sort of, that's not something you can just tell yourself to do. You need to train yourself to do it. I think philosophy is remarkably well equipped to do this, but any scientific training will train you to spot good and bad arguments and assess evidence and so on. And perhaps one can do a bit more of that in the schools and sort of have this general training for assessing arguments and trying to disconnect them from questions having to do with politics and values.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that takes me to this kind of circling back to this trust piece where, I feel like if we have to rely on us getting better at critical thinking as a population, I'm not sure I have a lot of optimism about that. But it does seem like there's been little cracks, and you can, tell me if your research you're also seeing this in sort of, if you can lower some of these perception gaps, and you can lower the animosity, and you can lower, that part of it, that does begin to open the door for some dialogue. And that seems to have a little bit, I'm a little optimistic on that front. Are you seeing that in your research as well?
Yeah, I mean, so there are some things. But first of all, I just want to say, no, we shouldn't put all our trust in people's critical thinking skills. You asked me what I can do as an individual. That's what I can do as an individual,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I think the focus on the individual is in a way mistaken, and this connects with the social dimension of knowledge that we were talking about. Because as individuals, we are not better than our epistemic environment is. So if we live in a polluted epistemic environment, we have a lot of disinformation. That will affect our critical thinking skills. Why is that? Well, our capacity to think critically depends on what we already believe, what we have in our system, as it were. So if I have a lot of mistaken beliefs, I will assess evidence in a mistaken way. So I'm sort of a prison to my epistemic environment, a prisoner to that. And therefore, I think putting all the blame or all the focus on the individual is a mistake. And we need to talk much more about how to deal with the disinformation that's on social media and so on. So that's one thing I really want to stress. We need a well-functioning information environment for us to function well as individuals. But then one can also, of course, talk about these things that you're suggesting. What can we do to have better dialogue with people who disagree with us? How can we sort of make progress that way? And there's a lot of research there now. And one of the more interesting things, I think, are these various experiments or, actual carrying out of deliberative polling and citizen assemblies and things like that. Our best reasoning happens in groups. Groups can be very dysfunctional reason-wise too, and it can be groupthink and so on. But when the conditions are good, we're really good together because we correct each other. We correct each other's confirmation bias. We question each other. We go the way science works, right? And I think if one can use this also on a sort of scale that up and use that in democracy on contentious issues, such as climate change, how to deal with climate change. I think there's real hope that people can meet. And there's also evidence from these polling experiments that people, even when people end up disagreeing, they understand and respect the other viewpoint. And that's really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that seems like a very risky, it's putting us in a very risky situation, this animosity we have towards each other right now.
Oh, it's extremely risky. First of all, public debate doesn't function anymore. And public debate is supposed to give you the basis for, good political decisions. But it also causes, of course, and that we've seen in the US, but not just in the US, it causes this, what they call affective polarization. That is emotional polarization, where you have the view of the other side as an enemy, as morally corrupt, as someone you can't collaborate and compromise with. And democracy dies when that happens.
Yeah, and that's kind of where we are.
Kind of. Close to, yeah.
Very close, yeah. So, when I heard this idea of you're sort of a prisoner to your epistemic environment, that kind of it feels like that spins over into sort of a social justice question too, that, if, that it's not a fair playing field out there.
Yeah, I think that's right. And this, of course, is not completely new. It was always true that, the quality of the schools mattered tremendously. And that's also a social justice question. and it matters to how well democracy functions. But now, of course, with the new media landscape, you get this very, very difficult situation. In our research team, we have a book called Knowledge Resistance in a High Choice Information Landscape. That's what it is, high choice, right? It's in principle, or in practice, unlimited number of sources to choose between. And if you know a lot, you'll find your way. As a researcher, it's a fantastic time. I can go out and find all the research I want, and I know how to find the reliable sources. And it's a huge asset. But if you don't know your way, have enough background knowledge, if you don't have that training, you can so easily get completely lost. And that is a social justice issue, completely.
Yeah, and there's also, that also reminded me of a lot of other research I'm seeing now, and again, I don't know if it aligns with what you're seeing as well, that there's not just a challenge with sort of misinformation itself, there's also just a fundamental challenge that, the populace in general isn't seeking information. So like the things you were just saying, like you're good at going out and finding good information, that's because you have a desire to go find good information. That's not a desire most people have. And so whatever information they're getting is just kind of whatever happened to slip into their entertainment and their sports and their other things, because they're not out there seeking good information or good news.
Yeah, no, and that's true for all of us to an extent, right? Because it's when you scroll your whatever social media you're using, you sort of get stuck and it's entertaining, most of it. And you're not really doing it because you're looking for anything, right? And then, of course, the algorithms are designed to keep us on the platforms. And what keeps us on the platforms is not necessarily what's true and reasonable, but what's kind of, scary or intriguing or sensational and so on. And that's our psychology is exploited in terrible ways by these platforms. We know that. We're all a bit in that situation. Even if you're a researcher, you also actively go out and search stuff in a way that maybe most people don't do.
Is that a possible, among, the ideas that you maybe have been looking at as ways to improve things, is that a possibility there that maybe those algorithms could inject some quality information along with all that entertainment and sports?
Yeah, no, I think something has to happen there. And it's not going to happen by itself, right? So I'm sort of increasingly leaning towards the conclusion that you need some light legislation around the platforms and their algorithms. At this conference where I was, a lot of people talked about how we have this sort of, godlike technology combined with our Paleolithic brains. I can't say that word. Stone Age brains, right? Because our brains are the same. Our psychology is the same since Stone Age times. And then we have this godlike technology. And the way the technology is set up now, it manipulates our brains. What we should do instead is try to set up technology so that it makes our brains as good as they can be, as it were. That might not be a good business model, however, and that is the fundamental problem with a lot of what's going on right now.
Right. A lot of it's about incentives, both, politicians, and because, they benefit from us being mad at each other, until they don't, I guess, until it turns into
until
civil
they
war.
Don't, yeah. Yeah.
But they benefit from, there's all these sort of perverse incentives out there.
Yep.
So, this is as you said, is a very big multidisciplinary research project. And so I think this question is you could probably talk for 2 hours on this, but so what is kind of the next step? What are you seeing as sort of some of the what can I look for in 6 months? What can I expect to find?
Well, we have just decided, the sort of first year or two, we spend a lot of time on the diagnosis, right? And there you need foundational work in philosophy, like what are we even talking about when we're talking about knowledge resistance? A lot of sorting out of that. And then within the individual groups, also there's a lot of intradisciplinary work, of course, as well, trying to sort out what the sort of media communication science can tell us right now about how the flow of disinformation, so on, all that. So we've been sort of working our way up to that with the sort of diagnosis and the causes. And now we've decided that the last bit will be try to look more at cures, as it were, which is the kind of thing that you were asking me about before. That is to say, what can you do to counteract this stuff? And then on different levels. One is on the individual level, of course, like we were talking about. And that is where the psychologists mostly are. But then also about what we can do on the level of the information landscape and what we can do. One thing the political scientists keep talking a lot about is the sort of how much of this comes from what the elite actors, as they call them, that is opinion leaders and politicians, do and say. Because disinformation, when it really makes an impact, it's because these opinion leaders are spreading it. That, of course, is not something that is easily solved. So that's one thing too. But we are now focusing on the counteracting part, because we're sort of have 2 years left of the program. So that seems a reasonable place to be.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I'll definitely want to circle back then and see what that all looks like, because that's the question we're trying to answer here on the podcast. Everybody wants the magic pill.
Yeah, well, there's not going to be a magic pill, that's for sure. Precisely because there is this complexity of factors that are causing it: internal, psychological, external, political, and information-wise. But there might be a combination of things. And I think in this context, it's quite interesting also to mention I guess you've heard about it. We had a session on that at the conference too. There's now the equivalent of the IPCC for the information environment, International Panel of the Information Environment, where they try to collect the best research across the world on about how we can counteract disinformation mostly, and sort of do proper meta studies and really try to get the knowledge there. And there's already some data out there. However, moderating content and flagging disinformation, that works. So there's some results there already that's worth keeping an eye on as well.
All right. Well, Professor Wikforss, thank you so much for making time to come on the show. I really appreciate it. This has been very insightful. I think the audience will really enjoy this talk.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.